right, good evening, everyone. So welcome once again to the next in our series in this President's Dream Colloquium. I'm Juan Pablo Alperin. I'm an assistant professor in the publishing program here at Simon Fraser University, as well as an associate director of the Public Knowledge Project. And for tonight and for 2 more weeks, I'm also the host and the chair of this fall's President's Dream Colloquium. Before we get started, I'd like to invite Elder Margaret to give us a few words of welcome.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you. I love it when everybody is awake. This is my second event today. The first one today was with another institution, and we were celebrating Remembrance Day, talking about all the veterans who had gone to serve to protect our country. And believe it or not, a lot of students hadn't even heard about Vets Day. It was a really surprise for them to even hear about how many of our people, not just First Nations people, but all the people that we know that had served in different wars in different countries, and the loss in the families and wondering where they went. And it was quite interesting to have students, because they're doing I think they're in whatever they're doing, they're writing exams or papers or something, but anyway, they were all sort of ready to get back to work, get back to their studies. And one student says, I don't know why I even bothered getting a higher education. He says, I'm not even going to get a good job. And we all sort of looked at him, and he says he wanted to be an administrator in accounting or something. And he comes back and he says, I'm sorry, I'm just having a bad day. But anyway, for those of you who are struggling or having fun or whatever you're doing with your studies, good luck. And just a quick prayer to get the evening going. Great Spirit, thank you for bringing us together this evening. Just watch over our families while we're away from home, and thanking our communities for allowing us to do the work that we do, and also our families for the time that we miss with them. And just a very special blessing on each and every one of you and your families for what you are doing and what you will be doing in the future. All my relations.
Thank you. Thank you, Elder Margaret. Now, those that have been joining us for the other talks in this series, you know that this is the part where I first go on to say a lot of words about how important this topic of public knowledge is to me, and to and the commitment that the university has to being engaged and to being to really committing itself to being open and participating in not just with the university community, but in the community writ large. Even though this is the President's Dream Colloquium, and since we're now near the end of the series, I'm going to spare you repeating all of those words of motivation about the colloquium as a whole. I will also spare you now. We only have one more talk after this one, so that the spiel in promoting all of the future talks is getting shorter and shorter each time. So this time I can just say we have one more talk in 2 more weeks on the public mission of the university, and I think that will be to close off this sort of lecture series, will be the talk that sort of wraps up and brings back the very topic that the colloquium is about, around the role that of serving the public that the universities have. So I'll just leave the promo for those for that future talk at that. So in 2 weeks in this very same room at 5:30, we'll have Robin DeRosa come in, who is a person that's been working around open education and doing a lot of work around open pedagogy, in particular in the North American context, who I think will, and has been thinking a lot about how open pedagogy can help to bridge that gap between the university and the public. And I was saying, although this is called the President's Dream Colloquium, this lecture, out of all of the lectures that we've had, this is the lecture that I'm going to say that this is the Juan's Dream Colloquium lecture. Because this is the one that is, first of all, most closely tied in terms of the topic to the work that I do around scholarship and around scholarly communication issues, my work around Latin America, and it's bringing together 2 people that have been sort of instrumental in my intellectual upbringing in this space. I'm going to have first to give us an introduction to the topic and to our speaker for this evening, John Walensky, who was my director for my PhD, but also has been my friend, my mentor, and the person that really gave me my very first opportunity in this space. And so being able to have him here as someone that has brought me into this community around public knowledge, has shaping my thinking around the value and the meaning of public knowledge, and having him here to be able to introduce our speaker this evening is really quite an honor. And Hebe Vessuri, who I will leave the proper introduction to John, but also has been someone that, in terms of thinking about Latin America and Latin American scholarly publishing and the systems of science and technology that were shaping the region and the role that they have in the development. Again, Hebe was one of the first persons that has really been thinking and working in that space. And when you go back to all of the literature that as a graduate student I started to have to pour through, and you try to go back to the origins and you keep going back and trying to figure out where it all started. For me, it started with Hebe's work, and so having her here really is something that's quite meaningful for me. So I'll leave it with that, and I'll welcome John to the stage. John is the director of the Public Knowledge Project that's here at SFU. He's faculty with me in the publishing program as well. Well, I was giving the words, but you can come up and join me up on the stage. And he's also a professor, the Costa Family Professor in the School of Education at Stanford University. John has been written extensively about open access, and his book, The Access Principle, was another one of those sort of foundational works in terms of understanding and making the case for the public, the value of scholarship and the principle that's behind all of this work, and all of the open movement that we see talks about all of these things. But for me, John's work around laying out those foundations and then really articulating that principle so well, again, is something that is at the heart of everything that I've done. So with that, John, welcome.
Thank you, Juan. And we're going to get very sentimental here, all this, the genealogy of ideas and everything like that. In fact, I am going to play that card. But I do have to say, I want to encourage you to think about, in terms of your own futures, especially the students that are here. My association with Juan was based on a single email that he sent to our project many, many years ago from Buenos Aires. Huh? Oh, who's counting? Okay. 11 years ago, he sent an email to our project from Buenos Aires. And I hadn't met him, but I was in kind of a bind on doing work in Latin America because I had made a promise, one too many promises about what we would do. And so I kind of threw back this, Juan, I think it was about technology that you were interested in helping us in coding. And I said, well, what if you put on presentations all over Latin America for a year? It was kind of a dream colloquium again, a dream job that I happened to have available. He grabbed it, and it just went on from there. So don't be afraid to send an email, a cold email, we might say. We used to say cold calls, because sometimes it works out and can give a redirection to your life in many ways. And this evening's talk and the whole theme of this lecture, the whole theme of the lectures has been about this public knowledge, about the sharing of ideas. And the focus this evening is about the global scale of that. And that's a critical aspect. And Juan has been part of that, and Hebe has been as well. But I have one more little activity I want to do before the intro. Have you ever waited so long to be introduced, Hebe? And the suspense is killing you? Because this is another significant night for Juan and myself and others. The Public Knowledge Project is 20 years old this year. The project's been devoted to helping others share their knowledge on a global scale. We have built software, we have created research, we have been engaged in all kinds of advocacy around the idea that the research, the knowledge that the university produces should be, now wait for this, this is very radical, should be available for everybody. It's just so obvious, it's even hard to kind of say in a convincing way that in fact the work of the university should be public. And the scale of that public is much larger than we have conceived until the internet came along. That really did change the scale of things. And the idea that we could begin to share it on a global scale has been the source of the project, the Public Knowledge Project, as well as the source of these lectures. So tomorrow, and I can say this with conviction because I'm of an age where the retirement question often comes up. In fact, people say to you in this weird kind of way, so are you retired? And if it reduces the cost of a haircut, I'm like, yes. I'm very seriously thinking about it. But otherwise, I'm kind of like, no, what are you talking about? But it does come, and it is a change in life. And in our case, the Public Knowledge Project has had one person, a managing director at the very center of it, for the last, since 2005. You can do the math, 13 years, I just did it. For 13 years, Brian Owen has been serving as the managing director of this project. And the managing director is the person, Brian sometimes talks about the bean counting. Is it bean counting, if I get the right vegetable here? Legume counting, I think maybe that was the term you used. Or rutabaga counting, I can't remember. And the idea of the managing director is the one who keeps the course of things. You can have crazy ideas, you can be excited about different aspects, but the managing director ensures that it happens or doesn't happen, ensures that it is accountable, ensures that there is compliance with the grants that you get. So we decided that we would take tonight, because the Public Knowledge Project in 2005 was not global. The Public Knowledge Project had 100 or so, maybe 200 journals that it was working with. And Brian became a part of the project in 2005, and the project became officially part of SFU and the library here in 2005. And since then, we've grown to over 9,000 journals, and we're in every corner of the world helping researchers, scholars, teachers share the knowledge that they're producing, share the ways of consuming it and teaching with it. And Brian's been a part of that. So we decided, or Juan decided, or we decided in conversation, that we would dedicate this evening's lecture. Now, Brian was a little concerned because he thought it might make him sound like he was dead. That we've dedicated this lecture tonight to Brian, and that's not the case. We're saving an album for that. No, it's not the case at all. But I want you to join me in thanking Brian for 13 years of service and for wishing him the very best. Now, this retirement for Brian is a little different than you might expect. He's joining, what's the name of the beach? Britannia, of course, British Columbia. The Britannia Beach Fire Brigade. Close enough? Okay. So those of you living on the Squamish area, Sea to Sky Highway, can sleep sounder tonight, or starting Monday, because Brian's joining. And what a change from being a librarian to dressing up in the whole outfit and the whole thing, to help save lives, rescue cats. That's probably not fair. But Brian, I want to thank you publicly, and I want to ask everyone to join me in thanking Brian for being the managing director for 13 years of the Public Knowledge Project. Now, there will be a lecture tonight. Just hold on for 1 minute. I want to turn to Hebe. Hebe Vessuri is a scholar, but she's also a part of the history of Simon Fraser University. I don't know how well you know that history, but in 1969, this university was one of the new universities of Canada. There were other Trudeaus, other issues in those earlier days, and this university was one of the radical points and in terms of Canadian pride. So the 1960s, you've heard, you'll have to ask your grandparents, some of you, but it was a time of radical change, a time of great concern, a time of imperialism, a time when the world was beginning to rethink that legacy of imperialism, particularly focused around a war in Vietnam. And this university, as a new university, had new faculty, young faculty, that were very concerned. And even though I was living in Ontario, I knew Simon Fraser University as a radical center of critical thought around globalization and imperialism. And just a few moments ago, I discovered that Hebe was here, for me it was there, was here in 1969 as a faculty member for 1 year. And I want you to help me welcome her back to Simon Fraser University, and I want you to understand that what began in the 60s as a critique of inequality and an advocacy of social justice in terms of the circulation of knowledge, now in terms of many, many different aspects of a global world, a post-imperial world, not entirely then and not entirely now, and that Hebe's work has been focused in particular on questions of science and knowledge. So this was a field that we were just discussing earlier that actually began in the 60s as part of the critique of power. The idea that science could not be taken for granted, that science was susceptible to power, to imperial forces, and that the critique of science was part of the critique in favor of social justice and equality. And Hebe's work has been focused on that particular work and network of science and industry and power and authority to try to understand, not that science doesn't contribute, not that science doesn't have value at every turn, not that we don't want to see that knowledge circulate, but that the ways in which it circulates, the ways in which science is governed. Now, Hebe has such a list of awards that I invite you, many of you are on your phones and computers right now, yes, I want you to review those. There are at least a dozen awards from across, not just Latin America, but North America as well, particularly around this question of how the social sciences can help us make sense of science. And the field of science, what's called science, technology, and society, that intersection, is the focus of her work, and in some ways something that we have tried to address in the Public Knowledge Project. And that is the idea that the tools by which knowledge circulates are part of the power structure. And the centers of that distribution of knowledge are part of what we have to be sensitive to and critical of. Because the only way that knowledge is going to grow in a way that is fair to everybody is if it's in a global knowledge exchange. And Hebe's work has been part of that critique, and our work in the Public Knowledge Project has complemented that. So I welcome you finally to come up forward, Hebe, and I want you to give her a warm applause as someone coming home after almost 50 years, 49 years, in fact. Great. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Good. Lovely. Well, what can I say after this presentation? I go home, you continue. I'm really very, very pleased. I'm delighted to be here. Actually, yes, after, I don't know, almost 50 years, 48 years, I think. I remember I was here in 1970. It was, yeah, it was just after what happened in 69, that the social science area here in SFU was empty, practically. There were very few people that had remained. And I had already made my decision to go back to Latin America, but I was inspired to come here and from Victoria, from Vancouver Island, where I was living and teaching at the University of Victoria. And so I spent a very interesting, a wonderful year here in my last year in Canada. And so I'm very pleased, very moved to be here with you today, with Juan, with John, with all of you. So I will have a presentation that is going to be useful, at least to me, because I'm not used to speaking English every day, and so it will help me. But I don't know whether it is going to be boring for you to look at the thing. Don't look at it if you don't want, because it's practically what is there in writing. Huh? But well, okay, let's start. And I would say, well, okay, we are in a global world, it's okay, but I come from Latin America, which is connected with what you were saying before. So I can't help but ask myself, for example, whether it is still important for governments to strengthen the regional Latin American research space today. Does it make any sense at this day and age? Within the current frame of international competition, there are moments in which you say, well, that doesn't make much sense, really. Huh? But then, I don't know whether you are familiar with the cartoon series from Argentina. This is a cartoon from Kino. This is Mafalda. And Mafalda, for many years, I think she's almost as old as I am now, but she used to wonder whether what had happened to southern societies. No? They said, what did some southern societies do wrong to deserve some northern ones? This is, we are in a common world. No? And what she says is, what did we do wrong in the South to get that kind of north that is pestering us? No? So we'd like to comment on that. On the other hand, there is another term which was very fashionable at one time, but no longer today. The notion of periphery is out of fashion. We are told that it is an idea of the 70s, exactly, obsolete, defunct. In today's world of technological acceleration, everything seems to be networks, where free nomads in the open wide world look for their individual benefits through transient alliances and interactions with no other loyalty than to their own personal success, whatever that may mean. We continue to be in the middle of a digital cultural transformation. The convergence of diverse technologies came to change the power of machines, the power of the flows, the way in which ideas flow, and the power of all of us to influence the natural world. What am I doing here? Is that it? Well, however, at the same time that technologies were dramatically moving forward, many countries fell in the worst economic or social crisis since 1929. For example, today we have all this crazy situation in Britain with the UK and Brexit, with its colonial appendage of Northern Ireland. We have the USA and the Trump phenomenon. We have Germany, Austria, Italy, Spain, Russia, and in Latin America, we have Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, Ecuador, Mexico, just to mention the ones with which I am more familiar, and they are all in disarray. They are all in different kinds of difficulties. But we continue to be in the middle of a digital cultural transformation. The convergence of diverse technologies came to change the power of machines, the power of the flow, the way in which ideas flow, and the power of all of us to influence as the natural world. However, at the same time that the technologies were dramatically moving forward, many countries fell in the worst economic and social crisis since 1929. We've been saying that. I repeated that, didn't I? What does it happen? I don't know what I did. So in all of these, open access and the networks related to it were really in the middle of the whole thing. Although the collaborative potential of internet is undeniable and obvious progress has been made, social networks have proven to be a double-edged tool. And as far as science is concerned, digital gaps persist both internationally and within national boundaries. But then we look at scientific participation from the South, from the global South. Since a great deal of the present science competition is managed through mainstream journals, the aim of shaping science policy for Latin America or for any peripheral region of the world, if the word peripheral is still allowed, must pay a good deal of attention to the mechanisms underpinning the production, circulation, and consumption of such journals. To what extent are scientists from the periphery actually contributing to the solutions of problems mostly affecting rich countries? Why is this so? What scientific questions are being slighted or even ignored with the present system to the detriment of national or regional needs? Well, such is the general context within which my talk today deals. No? And what I want to mention, to comment, is about this invisibility of the South. No? that it persists. We talk a lot and we do things, and there are many efforts, many attempts, but the scientific invisibility persists. The lack of visibility of scientific production in the non-OECD world continues to this day, and it is a symptom of a poorly globalized knowledge system. It could easily be interpreted as a generalization of the not invented here syndrome, where invention is supposed to take place in OECD countries. And this is something that affects the perception of knowledge production in the South. Oh, well, this is not produced here, it must be produced elsewhere in order to be useful, good, or whatever. Policies seeking to internationalize research in the South under the current dominant science communication regime are perceived by many to be a threat to the right of participating in the grand conversation of science as autonomous entities, as full scientific citizens. And this is something that in the art form, I think that could be expressed like some of Magritte's paintings about the invisibility and marginality of knowledge production in the South and the East. It is precisely this last point, one that it is hardly appreciated in the North, although it is keenly felt in the South, that has energized Southern concerns about equity in the scientific communication exchange. As repeatedly underscored by numerous studies and reports, fair access to international communication channel is fundamental to the fulfillment of participation and development goals. But the unpalatable bottom line here is that practically the only routes to scientific participation, as is strongly felt, is to publication, recognition, and visibility, that is, seem to involve expanding access to international journals, indexing services, databases, stimulating the growth of a particular style of journals, those that are more like other journals already indexed in the Science Citation Index, for example. Under such conditions, we can expect that growth in the number of publications reaches flooding proportions while being accompanied by a loss of diversity. And here I want to make another digression, taking as my reference Kino, the cartoon drawer, the artist. And that has to do with contingency or historicity, with accident, with ignorance. And this has to do with this old, very old man sitting there in his armchair and in his library and saying, well, and now that I know so much, what? And he has all the library and all the books that he has read and has studied. And this reminded me of the 1830, when British statesman Thomas Babington Macaulay stated the superiority of, and I quote, a mere shelf of a good European library over, quote again, continue the phrase that is, all the native literature of India or Arabia. And it's interesting that Macaulay, in passing, did not know either the languages of India nor of Arabia, the one that is well spoken in the Arab world. He was not the first and nor the only one to despise what he ignored. Indeed, if it can be said that Southern science discourses share a core tenet, this would be the right to share and participate in international and more recently in global science. A frequent strategy to achieve participation has been through international collaboration. While Latin American co-authors receive much fewer citations than their Euro-North American counterparts, through collaborations, they nevertheless enjoy an increased level of visibility. But is there a price associated to this apparent gain? The underpinnings of this reasoning is the belief that researchers behave like individual intellectual entrepreneurs at work in a globalized market of facts, concepts, and theories, although most real, active Southern researchers do not feel well this image of individual free agents. At issue here is that in the South, scientific research, except for very fundamental science, cannot be divorced from the problems of development, poverty, asymmetry, or whatever one would like to call them. Since the elaboration of core science in the early years of the Science Citation Index, countless numbers of journals were condemned to invisibility, an invisibility that largely accounts for the phenomenon of lost science in the world. This is not surprising. It is not surprising that in terms of concrete experiments aiming at overcoming this invisibility, the South leads experiments with different alternatives. And here we have open access. And of course, I mention Latin America because this is the region I'm more familiar with. But the broad embrace of open access in Latin America is significant, though it coincided in a paradoxical way with the changing role of research in the Latin American university landscape in the second half of the 20th century. National science councils and universities began to organize their research parameters for their staff, modifying traditional evaluation mechanisms just at the time when radical digital era changes in scholarly communication at world level were picking up speed. The new initiatives initially relied on so-called gold standards, particularly what we had then, the Science Citation Index, dependent on a limited list of ranked publications. The thing that I said that compressed the immense number of publications to the list of the good ones. This ensured, among other things, that only a small number of scholars were recognized with no middle ground or clear ladder of legitimacy and authority within the region. In short, the evaluation protocols that had been implemented in the North when paper journals were secure, that is, this has happened in the North when there was a mature system that could assimilate in some way this transformation, but that began to take effect in Latin America on the eve of the demise of the print journal culture. So when you had the new digital thing, the Latin Americans were only starting to make research a serious business. What had been a gradient then between national and international prestige and visibility until then rapidly became a deep gap. No? From this link, you had two completely separate worlds. And I witnessed, among other journals, I was a direct witness of two journals in the region. One, this is Interciencia. It was the interdisciplinary journal from Venezuela, but it was sponsored by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So that's why it was Interciencia, because it was for the whole region. And that was published in Caracas at the time when Venezuela was a rich country. It was bought by Pergamon Press in the 1970s, in the early 1970s. But after a short while, Pergamon returned it to Interciencia Association because the operation turned out to be unprofitable in view of the convoluted mechanisms by which Latin American scientists bypassed domestic regulations of foreign exchange, that hindered the payment of the journal subscription, etc. It is people manage, and in the publishing house manage, because every scientist who went from one country to another to attend a congress would bring in the money that each individual member of the association could give him to pay the subscription that he was not authorized. He couldn't do it through the banks because there was currency exchange restriction in that particular country or in the other. It was a common situation of the whole of Latin America. So Pergamon Press could not deal with that kind of thing. They would say, well, no, don't bother. It's a small journal. We're not going to bother with that. And so they said, no, come on, you people, you take it back. We don't want it. First, they had seen the promise of Intersciencia for an international audience because it was, he had a good reputation within the ISI and everybody that wanted to publish in Latin America would have his paper, her paper in Intersciencia and so on and so forth. But then Pergamon said, it's not good business, take it back. The other journal, again from Venezuela, it was the journal of the Venezuelan Society for the Advancement of Science, this Acta Científica Venezolana. This, in 1983, received news that the Institute of Scientific Information from Philadelphia had decided to drop the journal from its current context and from its Life Science Citation Index and the ISI Biomed publications, although it will still keep it in the system through the ASCA, or that is the Automatic Subject Citation Index, and they did it for a while. But the explicit recommendations of the publishers, Garfield and the people in the journal, in the official ISI message to this ACV journal, it was mentioned that every year, as part of the normal process of renewal, it eliminated some journals from its registry, taking into account aspects such as their impact factor, that is the number of citations registered in ISI publications, space considerations, recommendations from specialists, and the time each journal had been reviewed. But besides, it recommended to change the name of the journal. It was the Venezuelan, the Acta Científica Venezolana, because it was the journal of the national scientific community, to Latin American Journal of Science. Also to use English, not Spanish, and to produce the journal on time and regularly, which of course it was a good reason, because it wasn't very punctual at the time, no? But it tended to be punctual, but not as precise as that. So here we have an example, or two examples then, of good intentions, but bad results. Mm-hmm. So always when we have measures taken, we have to take into account the collateral damages. In the process, national autonomy in the definition of research priorities turned to be an unreachable goal for Latin American countries. We had the expression in these two journals, which you could have had the platforms for producing science policies, for ventilating ideas that were of concerns of the national scientific communities, to have local people being trained in publishing their first papers, because when you study, you want to have your disciplinary skills in your mind, but not necessarily, you were not taught to write a paper. But then if you had the local journal, you could do it. But although the ultimate justification for research activity in Latin America has long rested on the aim of building national scientific communities as tools of modernization and development, the goal wasn't achieved, because the assessment policies implemented acted as contradictory forces. It is the evaluation system that the science councils adopted generally as a general form in Latin America to improve the quality of research that was being done, to make it more internationally legitimate, to make it look and be better, they were taken so narrowly that they prevented the possibility of really acting as tools of development and modernization. evaluation became the discriminating, disciplining tool in science. Quality in science surreptitiously came to be equated with excellence. And excellence, in turn, identified as it was through a system of competition, inexorably led to adopting the international agenda and postponing indefinitely the scientific attention to local problems. Being excellent could not mean anything else but competing successfully with the best scientists of the North, as if the North covered all the possible angles of scientific research. And in order to be able to compete with people in the North, you had to take their research topics as well and be as good as them, or try to have a conversation and a competition with them. In short, Latin America is poised to rely on its own journals and repositories to ensure access to its research results, as well as its preservation. What remains to be done today is making sure that all these research results be recognized all over the world for what they are really worth, and not for what some indices such as Web of Science and Scopus determine they are worth. This is the real issue to be tackled once the quality issue is sufficiently covered by adequate editorial means. But here then we have to be clear then that there is something that is knowledge politics, which is different from science policy, because they occur in different contexts, they involve different people, they lead to different agendas. So is there a shared concern or not? Sometimes there is, sometimes there is not. The production of knowledge and the use of knowledge produced in society matter differently for people worried by knowledge politics and science policy. And something we have to be clear is that knowledge has always been inextricable from the economic and the political. I don't know why now I probably had some marks down and it goes one line and after the other one. Okay. Political economy necessarily redirects our analysis towards, what am I doing? Does it move? Yes. Towards institutions, economic imperatives, changing knowers, charismatic actors, culture and myth, promising economies, the cultivation of susceptible subjects, the strategic use of complexity, the workings of political systems as key components in the analysis of knowledge modes, especially as they animate technoscience and innovation. Yet perhaps our attention ought to consider the challenge of changing knowers. More than ever, recent events have brought into relief the role of knowers' orientations in analysis of knowledge transformation. And something that is really impressive today is the explosion of ignorance. Consideration of the re-emergence, use, and instrumentalization of ignorance has become rather urgent in light of recent sociopolitical events marked by the sense of an increasing impermeability to formal modes of knowledge and knowing. So this calls to the fragility of our knowledge regimes. The sense of an increasing indifference to facts, to knowledge, and the engineerings of ignorance show clearly the limits of analytical approaches to science, technology, and innovation that ignore the role of political economy in contemporary knowledge practices. Well, this moved, I don't know, what did I do wrong? The formatting is different in this thing, and I cannot go back now. Well, I don't know, how can I make it smaller? The format, okay, was still here, no? But it's y si no lo dejamos así como se ve ahí.
Ahí.
No.
Ahí está bien.
Sí, ahí está. Okay.
Ok, déjale con la flecha esta.
Okay, sí, okay. So I'm saying that in every context, we observe the fragility of approaches that assume that we are all rational actors, working with or even beholding to uncompromised facts. Well, where am I? No, here. And on the other hand, epistemic crises such as these also show the power and purchase of alternative universes of knowing, alternative worlds, replete with their own logics, beliefs, and systems of evidence and value, and of course also of ignorance and opportunism. The expansion and acceleration of global interconnectivity has significant socioeconomic and ideational implications that so far have served only to reconfigure the international system of higher education and science in a partial and unilateral way. And what we have is a proliferation of policy networks nationally and globally made up of operationally autonomous but structurally coupled organizations that blurs the boundaries between state, economy, and civil society. National governments, especially those of small and fragile states, but also the big ones, experience a reduction in their capacity of driving their educational and science systems. Something that I can see recently is all this increasing policy intermediation. Since the 80s, there has been an explosive growth of institutions for policy intermediation. Their modus operandi is defined in terms of the generation, circulation, and implantation of models and strategies of ideas that are potentially agenda shifting. New social actors who are spatially mobile, ethically malleable, and able to speak indistinctly the languages of public, private, philanthropic value, are part of a global service class increasingly disconnected from national identities and loyalties. Independent advice? Where has trust gone? Experts often have specific and effective points of entry in the political systems, nested as they are in opaque networks of contacts. Their authority and legitimacy are thin, cultivated through management practices and intellectual activity, where a variety of opinions prevail and power becomes increasingly fragmented. The multiplication of supranational organizations and multinational corporations in the funding and dissemination of research is contributing to redefine the space of scientific, technical research, removing it from the previously dominant paradigm of national science. Remember that the whole thing after the Second World War was directed towards the development of scientific communities, the consolidation of science as a tool of modernization and development in the developing world or in the post-colonial world, right? Okay, so it had to do with national science. But today, we have something else. And it's this cure that today that we talk about globalization and so on, a most recent turn of the helm in some of the world power centers seem to be signaling a new change of direction, heading towards a recomposition of the national space and proposing a new trend to isolationism. It remains to be seen how far this new trend will interrupt the processes already underway in the globalizing current. But what are the implications for a true social science? A really global social science that avoids the pitfall of singularity, of past universalism, needs to grasp the contemporary world society, which hardly resembles the model of modern society envisioned by post-war social scientists. So, do we have a world with a more diversified social science? existing social science never envisioned that South America, for example, could advance to the periphery of China. That the interpolations between Bollywood, Hollywood, and telenovelas would shape early 21st century romanticism, or that attributes like sex, ethnicity, and race would remain central factors in explaining social inequalities in modern capitalism. We also have the fragmented subjectivities in the process of epistemic violence. The legacy of colonial domination is one of semantic deprivation, silencing the languages of the subaltern by disqualifying them, by ignoring them. No space for speech and thought has remained protected in colonial and post-colonial modernity. There is no space for expression, no actors, and also no discourses which are emancipatory ex ante. Observation and critical analysis should rather be directed at how spaces, actors, and discourses take effect in the complex interplay of power and difference. The possibility is open to achieve a reconfiguration of science from the inside out. But accessibility is not enough then. It seems important to keep one important distinction in mind. Making things accessible through electronic publishing plus the opportunity of being open access helps access and visibility. But for research results to be accessible, it's not sufficient to ensure they're being taken into account. In other words, so long as international researchers think that they can get away with the benign neglect of Latin America or African research without being faulted for negligence or incompetence, they will do so if only because it creates a kind of easy and lazy filter to reduce the heuristic burden of research. The point of all this is to make Latin American research, for example, as well as the research from other parts of the South, unavoidable, while resting on unassailable scientific foundations. That we're not talking here about political correctness, if that someone suspects so. So here we are not discussing issues such as indigenous knowledge or alternative epistemologies, but problem setting and framing. So it must be remembered that while it is true that the science, I'm sorry, what I did, no, here, that the science that is not visible does not exist. Formal visibility alone is not enough. Effective presence requires being in such a state of visibility that anyone neglecting it will be faulted for carelessness, incompetence, or ignorance. Presently, thousands of Latin American journals are accessible and therefore visible from any computer connected to the internet. But who cares to read them? Obviously, while much can be done to improve access, it will remain of limited value so long as the rest of the world does not feel it has to look at that research. Conversely, OECD countries have managed to erect their science as if it were the whole world science, and as such, indispensable. While much good and even extraordinary science does exist in non-OECD countries, it needs to be integrated at its right place within real-world science. So, where are we? Where are we going? How to identify possible and desirable futures for science in an equitable world? Well, this is all. Thank you very much.
Great, so we have time for some questions. Or some answers to Hebe's questions, that would also be great. Mm-hmm. Who wants to take the lead?
Yes.
Hebe, you talked about the achieving the equality that there needed to be quality achieved before the distribution to the world, as part of the requirement for distributing knowledge to the world. And I just wondered if you'd talk a bit about how that quality, how you see the quality aspect. There are concerns about journals that don't have that quality. There's a concern about misinformation on the web. Mm-hmm. How do we encourage a trust in a certain body of knowledge, and how do we establish that the quality is there?
Yes, well, there's always this question of the, first of all, the mistrust. You know? There's the bad quality as well. There's no denial for that. But very often what you had is that people are successful when they choose to publish according to the certain rules of the game and certain topics that are also in the game. And if you choose to be good, but working with topics that are of concern to your own society, area of problems in the region or whatever, that calls the attention of no one. You know? And so there is not an agenda that includes the problems that were all, in the old days, they would be called development problems. You know? So you had a group of people, a whole group of people, a bunch of people that went into problems of development, and they became the applied scientists. Today we're here, and I see that there's an applied science faculty, you know, this building. Well, but the people who used to work in development programs, they usually didn't get international visibility if they try to work in the agendas of their own countries. Yeah? Because the problems they chose supposedly were not interesting, or not interesting enough for an international audience. Yeah? When I was in Oxford, I had to choose the topic for my dissertation. And I was there with Evans Pritchard, who was the huge monster of anthropology in the UK for many years. And when I said, well, okay, I would like to study on the problems of the transition from the pastoral estancia to the capitalist agriculture and cotton production and so on. This was for anthropology, and Evans Pritchard said, oh dear, you know, I like you so much, but why you have to choose such a boring subject that has nothing to do with what we do here, enough that we are not working on Africa or on, in India, which is the topic of a specialty of Oxford, but you go and choose these people. Why not a patrilateral, you know, matrilateral cross-cutting marriage? That would be interesting. At least Rodney Needham would be interested in that. That is, there was already a definition of an agenda of research that institution had, or that discipline had, in that country, in that area of the world. And if you came with different problems that were actually very important, because we were working on the way we could integrate former isolated peasants or native people into the national society. And there were all kinds of arguments going on in the country and in the region, how you go about doing that. That was not fashionable at the time. And, you know, like that, you have very often you have that kind of situation. So you have a problem of quality, and we struggled with journals that they had many deficiencies in their technical production. And you had the problems in the disciplinary knowledge when you have good quality, bad quality, and so on. But the insistence of producing excellent researchers and excellent papers, instead of relying on elevating the level of quality, the general level of quality of the scientific production that you had, was very detrimental for the whole of science in those countries, because you were always secondary, because you were repeating the agenda of the North instead of contributing new topics for the international agenda. But the point is, we can do that with good quality. We cannot do that with bad quality, and this is the challenge. But the different countries in the region that have shown through their students that they can make it. And when I see here in SFU today, this afternoon, well, lots of foreign kids, from Asian kids or Latin American kids, well, you know, this is split. These people survive the environment of a northern university. So that shows that they can do it. Why can't they help to develop local research agendas that are rich and enriching for international science? This is the answer, but of course, with all the challenges that had. Are you tired or are you asking? Yes.
Do you have any concerns at all that the whole question might be rendered moot by China and the fact that a quarter of the world's population is rapidly being educated in universities in the Chinese language and are doing all their research in Chinese and publishing it in some of it, like a lot now, is still being published in English, but as soon as they get tired of us, they just say, "No, we publish in Mandarin."
Yeah.
And then we're all left out, except they're like a hamster on a wheel, just pushing it.
Yeah. Well, you know that in the 1960s, when I was in Oxford, I started to study Chinese. But of course, my vocabulary was never sufficient to read a newspaper, and I sort of renounced the thing of the possibility of studying Chinese. I started to study that in Buenos Aires before I went to Britain. And it was curious because the lectures at that time were given in the Taiwan embassy by the cultural attaché of the embassy. And one day, the lectures ended, and we never knew why exactly. But apparently, he got confused at what happened with some of the students. They were planning to go into mainland China and not to Taiwan. I don't know what's the problem. But with this, what I want to say is that it happened with English. It happened before with French, it happened with Latin, it happens with many other languages. And now we have a new era, this is setting in. I've just come from Panama a week ago, to 1 or 2 weeks ago. I was in Panama attending a UNESCO meeting, a regional Latin American meeting that coincided the end of our Latin American meeting with the beginning of the National Science Week of Panama. The second meeting, the science meeting of Panama, the inaugural conference was delivered by the president of the Chinese Academy of Science. And this was trying to coincide with the UNESCO meeting. And I attended one of the sessions in our meeting that was on this, what's called the Silk Road, the Maritime Silk Road cooperation that China has now. And it was interesting because, you know, it so happened, I found a student in one of the courses, lectures that I'm delivering in the southern part of Argentina. And this girl was going, actually, she left for China at the beginning of September to do a doctoral degree after she studied a master course in Brazil and an undergraduate program also in a different university in Brazil. She's from Argentina, from a province in Argentina. So you say, well, what's this? It's not a metropolitan person. And she went to China. And she goes to China to study international relations and international trade, I suppose, and so on. And she showed me the curriculum and the pensum, and it is half the content is learning Chinese. That is, they're going to learn Chinese and they're going to be taught in Chinese. I don't know whether she's going to survive or not, but there were 2 other Latin Americans that participated in that session that they were doing research and having exchange with China. So it's something that is coming, you know. And I say, well, I already have made my effort to learn English. I'm not going to learn Chinese now, but then the next generation will have this girl from a remote province in the very southern tip of South America. She's learning Chinese to do what? She's interested in political science and international relations, and now she has to study Chinese. So such is life, but we don't want to depend on this or depend on the other, but have international science. How can we do it? When the technical possibilities are there, that now we can have automatic translation, I suppose. Every day it's going to be more and more feasible to be able to speak in your own language, to write in your own language, and some machine will translate, and so on. That's going to become trivial. But the way is, how can we avoid this disciplining of thought, of thinking, of what becomes the good science or the good knowledge in one or the other direction.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I was wondering what your thoughts on how funding has changed internationally with foundations such as Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Mark and Priscilla Zuckerberg Foundation, and because a lot of those organizations fund projects in the global south. So do you think that the way they distribute money can change this, or do you think it's made it worse, this continuous privileging of northern scientists?
Yes, I'm a bit deaf, and I don't know whether I've heard all that you said. We're talking about funding?
Yeah, how funding has changed, especially with large organizations such as Bill and Melinda Gates that are NGOs. So how do you think that has changed the landscape of this problem?
Yes, well, you have different trends here, because you have some NGOs that try to break new ground and to contribute to a more equitable society and so on. And you have NGOs that work for big multinational corporations, and that they try to follow some lines of research or some lines of thinking and disciplining that really that restrict the field of exploration to some areas of concern, and that is I find that damaging. But it's not that they are winning or that the others are winning. You have the two possibilities that are competing in the world. But I was reading, what was it? I can't remember whether it was this morning. I was reading an article in the New York Times about these midterm elections in the US and the big oil companies. And the amount of money that has been put in just to make sure that they were going to have some political results in the elections, it's really remarkable. Yeah? And so this is a particular area of concern. Well, political elections, but also you can have, the kind of research. We have fracking now in Latin America is coming forward, increasing momentum in places like Argentina that are going into that, and the technological message that the people get there comes from the north, comes from the big money from the oil companies in the north. And that's it. It's part of the game. So I'm very skeptical about that.
I'll use my moderator privileges to ask. I'll ask a question and then I'll pass it back to you, Vessuri, because the question that I've been wanting to ask is it's a frustration that I'm getting. All the work that I've been doing in Latin America now going on for 10 years, I've also seen how the knowledge politics that you're saying is not the same as science policy, but how much I've seen in some countries in particular, the knowledge politics are really shaping that science policy, and we've stopped having science policy that is in the best interest of the nation, and a science policy that is shaped about sort of positioning the country politically by trying to align the research that's done. And it creates for me the conflict of not knowing, well, what is my role, or what is the role of the scientific community in pushing for something different, especially when you're from outside of the country that's chosen those national policies that, in my view, are committing that epistemic violence on its own people. So what is our role as a scientific community in pushing back, especially for those for when we're trying to push back on a region that we're not necessarily, or on a country that's not necessarily our own?
Well, I'm working in a, now I'm working on two processes, two case studies, you know, that make me think about the meaning and the value of academic freedom and of criticism. It sounds old-fashioned. Probably it is. You know, I'm old, of course, then I'm old-fashioned. But one of the cases is the demise of Soviet science, which is an interesting process that has not been worked as it should have been worked. That is, all of a sudden, well, we have this, the collapse of Soviet mathematics, Soviet physics. Particularly Soviet mathematics was a very important school at world level. Yeah? But it all collapsed together with the regime, the official regime that the Soviet Union had. That empire disappeared on thin air. Okay, that was the end of it. But then there was a diaspora of people, of former Soviet people, scientists that moved around the world. And it so happened that Mexico had a policy, a government policy, implemented by quite a conservative government. It was Salinas de Gortari that implemented the policy of attracting former Soviet scientists to Mexico. So there was this official CONACYT program, and they, well, come here. And so there were lots of physicists and mathematicians from former countries in the orbit of what had been the Soviet Union. They moved around. They went to Mexico and to other countries in the world, of course. But in Latin America was strange. There was this trans-regional migration. And then the other case I'm analyzing is also the destruction of the scientific activity in the country, of course, not only the scientific activity in Venezuela. This is still going on. It's an ongoing process. It's not officially dead, but it is an almost finished process. But then in the two cases, you had diasporas of scientists that go away, they go out of the country, they leave the countries, and they have to become exiled, find refuge, go in and sell, I don't know what, sausages or whatever, or continue to be scientists somewhere else. And that then brings you well, what are they? Or what am I if I identify myself as a scientist? If I'm a scientist, what is the important thing? And so you are left without a country. That is, you lost your country. And this is what they say in the responses of the interviews that we made. I have no longer a country. My country is where I live now, you know. My country has dissolved in thin air, and it's not the country that I had, and you know. But I'm a scientist, and so you go back into the only thing that you have, that are the networks, the connections, your discipline, your mental structure, and your freedom. And you try to keep your freedom and your authenticity, you know. And so you try to recover that. So you can be critical of the situation and go about it. sorry, perhaps I get in other topics, but I still don't know how to finish the papers. I have to write on that. But it has to do with conviviality. How we can have conviviality in contexts that are very different, that are asymmetric, and we have responsibilities with knowledge. We have responsibilities with, if we still believe in something that is democracy, or if it is I don't know, anybody can call them differently. Some people talk about civilized ways of being. There is that feeling that you have a commitment to. And so when I see the experts that very often come in terms of being experts in policy, public policies, and you have them disembark from different planes and come into in Africa, in Latin America, and so on. And they seem to be separate, individual, independent, and so on. But there is a common thinking behind them, because very often they come from the very corporations that set the frame of thinking. Then they say, well, where is that is not thinking of good policies, you know? But very often expertise is now also in the market. That's why I mentioned a market for policy making too, which is, to my mind, is no good. You know? We need good policy because we need also good politics, because after all, policy is not just technical things. You need to have good politics. But politics has been very corrupted. It says, oh no, please save me about politics. I don't want to have anything to do with politics. But then politics and policy, they are different, but they are engaged. You know, and so this is very difficult. I think that as scientists, we have to be loyal to science, to real understanding, to producing robust knowledge, and to be able to look critically at the society, your society, the other society, whatever. But you cannot say that you don't see. You need to see and watch properly, you know. I don't know. No recipe.
One last one.
So you brought up political isolationism. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering, I hope I can convey that question in a reasonable way. It is about a question that I asked myself some time ago. So it was about the surge in new preprint servers, starting with Archive, and now the Open Science Framework has made it easier to launch your own preprint server, which reminded me of the point of isolationism, because so you emphasize the potential of that move to isolationism to address more local issues, to kind of break out of that system which is currently dominated by the global north.
Dominated by what?
By the global north. Uh-huh. So I was wondering, because the move to preprint servers that get more and more specialized into sub-disciplines, basically any lab could launch their own preprint server, which feels like some kind of like a disciplinary isolationism, where you just basically say, let's move to our own server. Similar to movements such as Cielo, which feel like a geographic or linguistic move to isolationism, where you're basically saying, we are in the same geography, we speak the same language, let's create something for us. Which overall feels for me like, so my question is, do you see that as a move, using other words, to kind of like back to the scientific tribes, which could be disciplinary, linguistic? And how do you feel about the potential, the positive sides of that, as in contrast to the negative sides? Because recently I saw a tweet that addressed the topic of the preprint servers. And the point was, it was criticized that nowadays everyone is launching their own individualized, isolated servers, instead of contributing to these central places that were introduced with the idea of centralizing knowledge, of curating, archiving knowledge and creating a space where it's accessible. So how do you feel about this contrast between the potential of kind of returning to these smaller tribes instead of trying to deal with the global knowledge production and the risks and dangers of maybe falling back into this tribalism?
Well, I think that we are already, well, I hope so, at a stage in which we're not going back to the tribal. Of course, history will tell, you know, and it may happen, but the point is not necessarily globalization is the final thing. You know, globalization is a proposal, is a proposition. And it has been a process that has gone into that. But it has some flavor of success. No, successful, the globalization is the success of someone or some group of people and so on. But I prefer to talk about transnationalism. I don't like nationalisms as such. I never liked that, particularly, you know, carrying the flags and that kind of thing. But transnationalism means a pluralism, the possibility of having pluralism and not globalization. We have a world that has become smaller and smaller and smaller with the speed of air transportation, with the internet, with everything. It has become a tiny world. Right? So globalization is a word that I dislike. But that doesn't mean that I would prefer isolationism. No, I think that it's very good that we can have a plural world, and that, as I said, with the machines, we can have automatic translations, and eventually the translator is not going to be a betrayer, it's a traduttore, traditore, but we can have good translations and we can understand each other. I think that people can understand each other when they meet and are able to talk. And so pluralism will need the introduction, the incorporation of research and exploration of ideas and archives and so on, made of different results that have been produced by different people in different societies, in different particular contexts. And all that now people in the environmental sciences are beginning to use that kind of stuff, you know, going from the local to the very broad scope of the planet. And this is valid for all the sciences and for all the kind of knowledge and cultural experiences that we may have. So we can have some interesting futures that not necessarily mean isolationism or globalization. No? I think that this is possible and desirable.
And that, I think, is a great note to end on. I invite you all to join us for a reception just outside here. We've got some things to continue the conversation, just some things to eat while we can enjoy continuing to talk to each other. But before we do that, please join me in thanking Hebe for coming all this way and giving us this wonderful talk.